Ladies and gentlemen, it is this week, and what I mean by that is this week Battlefield 6 comes out, and unlike its predecessor 2042, this one actually has a campaign, which means it has a story, but I mean 2042 does as well, and we're going to go over all of that today, because over the past year, we have been diving into the stories of the various Battlefield games, preparing ourselves for Battlefield 6. Over the past basically 2 decades, all of these games have come out, and lo and behold, they are all on the same timeline. Now, if you didn't see my video from last week going over the connection between every Battlefield game, we'll touch on it today, but you probably want to check that one out first. It'll be linked in the description or after the video. As far as this video goes, though, this is going to be the entire timeline of Battlefield. It doesn't quite hit all of the games, but at least like the games within the past 2 decades, it is going to cover all of that. So without further ado, this is the full timeline of the Battlefield universe. It is spring of 1915 and World War I has just begun. In a mission called The Runner, we play as a character by the name of Frederick Bishop. And in this mission, this is one of the most brutal Allied offensives against the Ottoman Empire. We play as Frederick Bishop, however, we're alongside our kind of mentor or young recruit who's actually underage to be in the army by the name of Jack Foster. Now, as they push up onto the island, Bishop is ordered to deliver critical messages between command posts across the front lines and the back lines. He breaches cliffs and uses horses to go from one to the other. And as the fighting intensifies, eventually they are warned that they need to retreat as the dreadnought is going to rain hell down upon the island. However, Frederick Bishop isn't able to get to the front lines in time, and his mentor, Jack Foster, ends up moving in. Now, Frederick Bishop ends up getting there and taking one of the biggest sacrifices for his team. He climbs the mountain all the way up to the castle, and doing so distracts the enemies, in turn allowing his army as well as Jack Foster the ability to retreat. Now, seeing the flare, it signifies that Jack Foster has got to safety. However, Frederick Bishop would never see safety again. Fast forward 2 years to the spring of 1917. In this one, we are following someone by the name of Clyde Blackburn, whose grandson we will end up seeing nearly a century later in the year 2014. But we'll get to that one later on. As far as Clyde Blackburn goes, he's an American who ends up being an imposter in the British Royal Flying Corps. In this mission, you start off in a dogfight tutorial where you quickly run into some Germans, following them and eventually finding a munitions camp. Now, at this point, you are pretending to be George Rackham, an actual British pilot. However, you are working alongside his co-pilot by the name of Wilson. Now, when we find this munitions base, we bring it to the higher-ups, which Wilson really didn't want to do, but then we end up attacking. When we do, we make a promise to Wilson that we will keep him safe. Now, the problem is Clyde Blackburn is a liar, he's a cheat, he doesn't have very much integrity, so when they end up crashing behind enemy lines, there's a moment where Clyde Blackburn has to decide what the type of man he is going to be for the rest of his life.
What about being heroes?
I'm no hero.
But you gave me your word, your bleeding word. So you think you're a decent bloke who's gonna help me? Oh, you're a lying, no good bastard. Who'll look me in the eye and finish it. Come on! Which is it? Put your cards on the table, Blackburn. You're not George Rackham, are you? Son of the fourth bloody Earl of Windsor. How naive do you think I am?
Let's get out of here.
From here, Clyde ends up carrying Wilson to safety, proving what type of man he really is. Now, it's unfortunate, but after this, he gets caught for impersonating himself as George Rackham and taken back to London. Now, this is right as London ends up getting attacked. He hops in a plane and basically leads London to safety by taking out some blimps, landing in some water, and well, that's Clyde's story. Moving forward to the spring of 2018, this is a story of Lawrence of Arabia, or T.E. Lawrence, I guess. This is all set during the Arab revolt against the Ottoman Empire. In it, we are in the desert, and essentially in the set of missions, our job is to take out a massive armored train known as the Iron Horse. After fighting through several of the Ottoman Empire's forces, at one point being captured, we eventually end up taking out the train via a lot of explosives and artillery and are successful, and is one of the reasons why the Arab revolt was actually possible. Later that year, in fall of 2018, we follow the Italian Arditi against the Austro-Hungarian Empire. We play as a character by the name of Luca, who is fighting in the Italian Arditi alongside his brother, however, is in a different set of forces. And after fighting his way up a mountain, giving his brother kind of overlook, airplanes come in, and these airplanes bomb the mountain that his brother is on. Now, going to the castle where the Austro-Hungarian Empire are kind of hunkered down, he is there and he is looking for his brother. However, upon finding him, we find out that his brother will not be getting any older.
No! No!
He never got older. And here I am, still.
At around that same time in the fall of 2018, close to the end of World War I, we follow another character by the name of Daniel Edwards, a former chauffeur who joins the British Mark V tank crew, which included McManus, Finch, Townsend, and Pritchard. Together, they pilot a tank called Black Bess, a character essentially in and of itself. Now, eventually, they end up getting stuck in the mud in an area surrounded by Germans. And when all else is lost, their last-ditch efforts, they are able to get a pigeon into the air, which is the only way at the time that they are able to send for communication. And just in the nick of time, the pigeon sends back to their coordinates, letting their team know where to shoot the artillery. And upon when they do, they end up becoming free. Now, they end up having to fight their way all the way through behind enemy lines, fighting through waves and waves of tanks, as at the end of World War I, tanks became way more popular, but by the very end, this is what ends up happening.
Are you okay, Edward? Sorry, Bess.
Townsend ends up blowing up Black Bess, and somehow, I don't know how, Edwards survives. Now, this push towards Cambrai may have won the war, as just 1 month later, the war was over. There was over 300 tanks that participated in this battle, and thousands upon thousands, of course, died. But one person who didn't was Daniel Edwards. Neither did his friend McManus. But the same thing couldn't be said for everyone in World War I. Not so whatsoever. And in fact, when you were sent to the front lines in World War I, you were expected to die, which was shown throughout the campaign extremely well. Now, the thing with World War I is they said it was the war to end all wars. But as we know, it wasn't. And in fact, really, if we look at it, it was truly just the beginning. We begin in the year 1942 under someone by the name of Billy Bridger. He has just been thrown in prison for, well, robbing banks, and we find out that his father was also robbing banks, but one individual person by the name of George Mason saw something special inside of him, and at the time, they were running low on troops and trying to find new ways of recruiting them, and their way was going for the prisoners. So George Mason makes Billy Bridger a deal: your freedom in return for your service. So Billy joins the special boat service underneath the Royal Navy, and when he does, they end up in Africa. Now, in this battle, they push in, and eventually Mason ends up getting injured. So Billy takes it upon himself to go get some meds, go get some bandages, things along those lines, and while doing so, he radios back to the Royal Navy, giving them the location and telling them that they need help. And well, he doesn't just let the Royal Navy know. So now, being hunted by the Luftwaffe, they retreat and try to defend their position, and when everything seems lost, they have tens if not hundreds of tanks coming over right at them. They are saved just in time.
Did our best, though, eh? I don't believe it!
Now, in case you haven't figured it out already, both Battlefield 5 and Battlefield 1 are based off of historical events. Similarly, one of a much earlier Battlefield game by the name of 1942 takes place, well, in 1942, following the events of World War II. I'm not going to go in depth, there's no real crazy story other than the real world story of World War II, but just to note that this game takes place right here. It is in the year 1943 where we dive into this story in Norway. In a mission called Nordlys, we find ourselves in German-occupied Norway. And specifically, what the Germans are planning here is creating something called heavy water. Now, we take up after a Norwegian scientist and her daughter who is trying to free her, as well as stop the project, because as we find out throughout the mission, the Germans are planning on using this heavy water to create nuclear weapons. So throughout this, we go in stopping them, trying to get them to stop sending this heavy water back to Germany. And by the very end, as we go to save our mother, both us and our mother make the ultimate sacrifice to stop the shipment of the heavy water.
Jeg så stolt av deg, Solveig.
We next move to August of 1944, specifically after the Normandy landings. We follow two French brothers by the name of Deme and Idrissa, who are fighting for the French. However, the French aren't sending them to the front of battle, giving them the horrible jobs, until one general sees something special and sends these men in specifically to take out German AA guns. Upon doing so, they end up essentially being captured. They're surrounded by German soldiers, and at the same time, if they retreat, they will be captured by German soldiers. So really, they have one option left, and that is to push forward. And the only place to push forward is to a German-occupied castle. And upon getting there, everything seemingly goes wrong. A tank bursts out, and all of a sudden, they're absolutely overwhelmed. But somehow, the French are able to take over. Now, Deme is about to be killed by the tank when his brother Idrissa hops into action, climbs on the tank, throws a grenade inside when the entire thing blows up, launching him off to the side. This is where Idrissa would pass away, a family man with kids of his own and niece and nephews left behind for Deme, and this was all for the French. They would celebrate, they would take pictures, however, they would end up being whitewashed from history, removed from the pictures and completely and utterly forgotten. But the thing is they never forgot. Fast forward to the spring of 1945. We are in a tank by the name of Tiger 237, and specifically, we are in the other side of things. At this point, we are in Cologne, Germany, and the Allies are slowly pushing forward, defeating Germany, and as they fall apart, they don't simply give up. And in fact, throughout this mission, we see scattered throughout the street various soldiers on the German army who have become deserters, traitors, and when they do, they are killed by their own army and even strung up and displayed so that others will no longer do the same thing. However, as we start to see throughout this mission, Germany has essentially given up, telling their soldiers if they find any sensitive material to destroy it or burn it. And eventually, as they call a large retreat, Tank 237 goes to cross the bridge, and as they do, their own army destroys it, leaving them completely and utterly deserted. And as Kurtz, the main tank driver, decides he's had enough of this, he deserts the tank and starts walking off into the distance, whereas the character that we play by the name of Peter Muller says to him to come back to the tank and pleads for him to be there. But by the end, this is what happens.
Komm, wir müssen jetzt.
Was? Stärke zeigen. Hä? Herrgott doch mal. Sieh dich doch um, Peter. Gott steh uns bei. Alles, woran wir geglaubt haben. Alles, was wir dafür getan haben. Es ist vorbei.
Now, these guys have been in the same tank together for years. They have become very close, and now Kurtz, the driver of the tank, is becoming a deserter, completely giving up on his army altogether, not caring what it means for him, as he knows he's pretty much dead anyway. And then this happens.
War ein Verräter. Kurt! Kurt!
Schroeder shoots Kurtz, calling him a deserter, but the friendship reigns supreme. Over their allegiance to their country, he gets out of the vehicle. And he tries to save him, but essentially, it's too late. And Schroeder yells at him to get back in the vehicle as the Allied assault moves closer and closer. Now you can see the look on Muller's face when he finally gives up on his own army. When he has to ask the questions whether or not calling his own people deserters makes him actually potentially the bad guy. Now, as he gives up and takes off his medals, Schroeder actually turns to him and starts to look at him as a deserter. And as Muller stands up, he gives in to the Allied assault, putting his hands up in the air, but Schroeder turns on him. And the only question we have left to ask at the very end of this game is, what is the final weapon that we hear? Is it Schroeder getting shot by the American grease gun, or Muller being killed by the German MP40? And this brings us to the end of what was said to be the bloodiest of all wars, the most death spilled by man in the history of the world. And as we know, that's not true. As we know, war never changes. Oh wait, that's the wrong game series. Now this is where Firestorm comes in. Yes, you didn't hear me wrong. That battle royale that was introduced with Battlefield 5 actually has a backstory that ties into the overall story of Battlefield, and it stems from a company by the name of Sulis. Its Sulis Foundation basically made a thing called Project Firestorm, which is a weapon of mass destruction designed to destroy a large amount of area slowly using a ring of fire. There's a reason why this is going to sound familiar, and you'll see as we move forward where this comes back in. But also, just remember the name of that company. Now, in the next part, we don't really have like a specific story or timeline or anything like that, but it's a Battlefield game nonetheless, and that is Battlefield Vietnam, spanning from about 1955 to 1975. And this was kind of another situation where they kind of just followed the historical events of the time and dates, and so if you want to know anything about that, there's plenty of history books for you to read through, but just know that that is the time that this one takes place. And after this, there's a couple of different things that you need to know to set up the next game. So the main thing that you need to know happens in the mid-1990s, so we'll just call it 1995, and that is the founding of the Middle Eastern Coalition. This is a coalition of Arab states that was established shortly before the war. Now, they joined the People's Liberation Army, which is essentially the Chinese army, and that sets up this game. So as far as Battlefield 2 goes, there wasn't necessarily a single player campaign or a story, but this is kind of what happens based off of the maps that are given. In the mid-2000s, we're aiming around 2003, there's a massive clash between the MEC, in other words, the Middle Eastern Coalition, European Union, China, Russia, and the United States. The MEC and China successfully invade the US East Coast, but fail to gain any more land and are forced to retreat. The US attempts to invade the Middle East, but the MEC resistance pushes them back. In other words, nobody gains anything and a bunch of people die in vain. But at this point, the MEC begins to dissolve, and that brings us to our next game. So in Battlefield 3, the story surrounds itself around a character by the name of Henry Blackburn. Now, by the very end of Battlefield 3, you find yourself playing as Blackburn going up to a villa where you run into a Russian character by the name of Dima. Dima holds you at gunpoint but eventually surrenders and gives you one option. And that option is to turn on your squad. And for some reason, Blackburn obliges.
Get down on the ground! I said...
The question is, why?
That better?
Yeah. Who are you? You CIA?
Good morning, Sergeant Blackburn.
Now, it is right after he pulled that trigger that the Marine of Henry Blackburn was brought into custody, and no one really understood exactly what happened. So then he was interrogated and tells a story of exactly what happened 9 months earlier in a mission called Operation Swordbreaker. So the entirety of Battlefield 3 takes place in the year 2014, and this mission called Operation Swordbreaker is a story of United States Marines moving into the Iraq-Iran area to stop a group known as the PLR, or People's Liberation and Resistance. Now, they are led by someone by the name of Solomon. We will come back to him, but remember that group we talked about earlier called the MEC? Well, when they dissolved, eventually some of the members of that group ended up joining the PLR, and because of what happened before, they simply became more and more extreme. And under this new leadership of Solomon, that was amplified. Now, eventually, Blackburn ends up making his way to a bank where him and his group, known as Misfit 1-3, you end up finding out that inside this bank vault, there is a bunch of Russian nukes, 2 of which have been taken out, and we find out that the person holding them is no other than Solomon. Now, we don't know what he's trying to do with these at this time, so we continue to fight in this war and eventually end up at that building that we saw at the very beginning, where we ran into that character by the name of Dima. And this is what Dima has to say to us.
Do not do anything stupid. This piece of shit right there stole 3 nuclear devices from Russia and sold it to a man called Solomon. Solomon's using the PLR. He has at least 2 targets, New York and Paris. He's using public transit to move the weapons. He's going to detonate the New York device at Times Square very soon. This cannot happen. We can avert war between our nations. Just two of us. No politicians. No money changing hands. Just two soldiers speaking the truth. Help me. Help me to do this. That's it. I have to leave now. You don't shoot him, millions will die.
And this is when Blackburn is left with a choice. Either he can pull the trigger, shooting his leader, becoming essentially a criminal, and saving Dima, or millions can die. He pulls the trigger, setting Dima free to go and try to stop the nuke, which is in Paris. So Dima is a GRU agent, which is basically the Russian CIA, and he's essentially working undercover. In other words, his government doesn't know what he is trying to do. So he goes into Paris with a small group of GRU agents that he's working alongside to go and track down this nuke before it can go off in Paris. Therefore, he's working here to save millions. And they think they finally have a track on the nuke, and they're hunting it down, and they get to the public transport where it needs to be stopped. However, they're misled. This is not actually where the nuke was. Yes, they found a PLR agent, however, that person wasn't the one with the nuke, leading for this to go off in Paris. And as I mentioned before, these are Russian nukes, which now Russia looks responsible for these going off. And specifically, Dima looks responsible for these going off. And guess who just helped Dima? That is Henry Blackburn. But not only that, as it turns out, Solomon is actually a CIA asset. So now it simply looks like Blackburn is the one trying to set off the nuke in Times Square in New York.
Solomon has the nuke.
Solomon is one of ours. He is an overseas asset, and he has been for years. We put him next to al-Bashir for information.
You are shitting me. He's a murderer. You saw the video.
Well, you get the good with the bad when it comes to assets, and sometimes sacrifices must be made for the greater good.
Isn't that your angle?
Jesus Christ, the nuke is still out there. Solomon's still out there.
So it's at this point that Blackburn realizes they are not going to listen to them. So he and his friend Montez, fully believing everything that Blackburn is saying, by the way, helps him escape. And when they do, luckily enough, the train containing Solomon is right outside the building. They jump onto the train and Blackburn works his way through, eventually working his way all the way up to Solomon. Now somehow this ends up into a chase scene where they work their way all the way to Times Square, where Solomon brings the nuke, and eventually Henry Blackburn puts an end to Solomon and therefore also puts an end to the PLR. Now this puts the world into a weird state, because in the year 2014 now Russia is against America. Russia is blaming America for the nuke attacks and America blaming Russia. The one other country and the one other superpower that doesn't really have much to say is China. So Russia does something drastic. Dima is still left alive, and in fact, Dima is disfigured by the nuke that went off, and Russia knows what happens but doesn't want to admit it. So what they do is they offer up Dima as a POW to China to cozy up with them, and this leads to this. So Battlefield 4 takes place in the year 2020. We are getting much closer to present day. Now, the real story here starts out on the USS Valkyrie, when our crew, known as Tombstone, the main people of which, as you can see here, are Pack on the left, Irish dead in front of us, and the character that we plays named Wrecker. Now, we're going to meet with a CIA agent known as Kovic, which just so happens to be the same person as one of the interrogators from Battlefield 3 who was interrogating Blackburn. Now, as China tries to rise as a superpower, someone by the name of Admiral Chang is trying to essentially become the dictator, and we are being sent into China to extract a mysterious asset that the CIA has. So we go in, and as we go to extract the asset, he ends up getting shot. So Kovic quickly has to extract on the helicopter with Hannah, who is supposed to be this mysterious figure's wife, as well as Kovic, the CIA, and the mystery man. Now, eventually we make our way back to the USS Valkyrie. Meanwhile, this mystery man is in the med bay trying to get healed up, but we are being attacked by China, specifically out of Singapore. So we have to defend the USS Valkyrie against an aerial attack, and we do so. However, Kovic manages to die in the process. Now, as he passes away, he gives us some information and specifically tells us that no matter what, if anything happens, we have to take down Chang and we have to trust Hannah. So our next job is to get sent into Singapore, destroy one of the air bases there so that we can get air superiority back. Now, as we do, things are seemingly going pretty well. Hannah even goes in with us because she has some strange military background. But as we go to destroy the military base, we get taken out as we are going to escape. And lo and behold, guess who turns on us? None other than Hannah.
Come on, damn it!
快来！他们在这儿，我抓到他们了。
The fuck? You fucking!
不要管他，他已经死了。带走这个。Couldn't be any other way.
So lo and behold, we wake up in a Chinese prison, specifically being held by Admiral Chang. Now, as we're interrogated and don't give in, eventually we are thrown back into our cell, where we wake up once again next to a mysterious Russian figure who just so happens to be Dima from Battlefield 3. Now, he shares with us that he has an escape plan who he's going to go alongside us, and that's exactly what we do. And halfway through the escape, we once again end up running into Hannah, who is trying to escape us from the prison as well. She explains that she had no other choice, and the person on board the USS Valkyrie is someone by the name of Jin Ji, the only person who can oppose Admiral Chang and the only other person that the Chinese people will actually follow. That is why he needs to be kept safe, and that was her job specifically, keeping him safe. So we end up escaping the prison and eventually make our way to a gondola. Now, as we make our way down the ski hill, it gets attacked, it falls, and lo and behold, Dima actually passes away from the crash. However, Irish, Wrecker, and Hannah end up making it out alive. So eventually, they end up finding themselves a vehicle and making their way back to a friendly military. However, when they do, they find out that they can't get airlifted all the way back to the USS Valkyrie unless they get air superiority in their area. And the way that China is holding that down is with a bunch of AA guns on top of a dam. So you go and blow up a dam. Now, somehow you survive this, and upon getting to the bottom, you then get airlifted out of the area all the way back to the USS Valkyrie. Now, the good news is when you get back to the Valkyrie, Jin Ji is actually awake, and upon making your way to the med bay, it's at this time that Chinese forces are boarding the boat. And Jin Ji tells us to let him show himself, and when he shows himself to the Chinese troops, they immediately surrender and say that they want to support Jin Ji. Except there's one problem. Admiral Chang has a destroyer that is currently attacking the USS Valkyrie. So the one thing that I forgot to mention is when you get back on board, the other person who you find alive is Pac. He's alive and well and somehow made his way back to the USS Valkyrie. So at this point, you are sent alongside Irish and Hannah to go destroy the vessel that's attacking you, Chang's vessel, if you will. And upon getting there, you plant the charge, grapple up to the top, and lo and behold, this happens.
Hannah, hit the switch!
Red! Something's wrong! There's no connection! Wrecker!
Fuck, give it to me! We gotta go back down!
Okay, well, only one of us needs to go. Wrecker!
So the switch for the C4 is busted, and we have one more charge of C4 that we can bring down, but you'll have to detonate it manually. In other words, from down there. Now your two options are give it to Hannah or give it to Irish. Whoever goes down there dies. Now you can choose either, but then the USS Valkyrie dies and then China takes over. So we know that that's not canon. But we also know what is canon, and that is giving the C4 to Hannah. Now you're gonna find out why in a couple of minutes, but basically what happens next is Hannah drops down, she plants the C4 on the boat goes boom, and we beat Chang. Again, this happens in the year 2020, which then leads us to this. Battlefield 6 takes place in the year 2028, and these events are incredibly important for the game that we're going to talk about after. However, if you don't know what the basic story is, of course we don't know the whole thing yet, we are facing off against a group known as Pax Armada. They are a mercenaries for hire, or a PMC group. In other words, you pay for them, they basically fight as an army for you. Now, we don't know who the highest bidder is when it comes to this game. We don't know who's funding them, who's running them, anything like that, but we do know who their commander is, and that is someone by the name of Alexander Kincaid, who I believe is Scottish, and clearly the main characters in the game know pretty well. Now, we play as a group by the name of Dagger 13 or Dagger 13, which in turn consists of 5 different people. So first of all, we have Cliff Lopez. By the age of 29 is a staff sergeant, and he's our support guy or medic. Then we have Dylan Murphy. He's our engineer at age 33, and he's a gunnery sergeant. We then have our youngest member at age of 27. She is recon, and she goes by the name of Simone Gecko Espina. This is followed up by our fearless leader by the name of Haz Carter. He is age 41. He's an assault class, and he's a master sergeant. And like I mentioned, he is the leader of Dagger 13. Then we have our character who's shrouded in mystery. We don't know much of a backstory on this character whatsoever. His name is Lucas Hemlock, and we don't have an age, we don't have a class, we don't have a rank. We got pretty much nothing. So with the falling of the UK and the disillusionment of NATO, this leaves Dagger 13 or Dagger 13 to be the only thing left in stopping our bad guys, who is Pax Armada. Now, we know that the president by the name of President Fernandez is also on our side. We are also working with the CIA, but we don't know what our group of Marine Raiders will do next. And that is the next game coming out just this week. But oddly, the year 2028 is special because that's where the story of the next game kicks off. So in the year 2028, untamable forest fires start across the world. I know it sounds very similar to what we heard from 1950, as well as what will probably be in the Battle Royale. Now that is in the year 2028, but after this, global disaster strikes the world with hurricanes, famine, and many other problems going on. And with the fall of the UN, which again is a part of Battlefield 6, we are essentially left with 2 different superpowers, the United States and Russia, and everyone that leaves those 2 are considered something completely different, non-pats or the non-patrioted. And they basically fall under no banner, but as you're going to see, they end up fighting for both. Now, this is where Irish, the character from Battlefield 4, comes in. In the year 2040, he was a Marine and ended up getting into conflict with some non-pats. However, he fell soft for one of them in particular, grew a relationship, and eventually the 2 of them grew a child together. Now, when the Marines ended up finding out about this, they immediately discharged him, and with that, he made his way to the non-pats. So at this point, Irish has a pregnant wife and he is kind of discharged from the army. Now, it is in this year of 2040 that he ends up taking his wife in to get a routine checkup and specifically get an ultrasound when a massive solar storm hits, knocking out 70% of the world's satellites. And during that storm, Irish's wife, Rafaela, was killed in it. A plane crashed into the hospital that she was in and killed her. And when he went to the hospital, he ended up finding a child who was also orphaned during the disaster and immediately adopted him, taking him into the non-pats and aboard a ship known as the Exodus. Now, he is sent on a mission to retrieve a briefcase, and in said briefcase there's supposed to be information on something to do with America. And when he goes on this mission, he ends up running into someone that he recognizes. So that is Pac from Battlefield 4, and when Irish confronts him about what was going on there, he warns him that the non-pats are not actually good like he believes, and he warns them that if they get whatever is inside that briefcase, it'll be the beginning of the next world war. And well, he simply doesn't believe him, but ends up finding out it is true. And when they come to get the briefcase, this happens. Now, the message ends up being sent back to the leader of the Notepats, which essentially causes the war which is taking place during Battlefield 2042. However, Pac is able to save Irish as well as his son, but unfortunately, it also leads to Pac's death. Now, another thing that we get to find out in the intel for Battlefield 2042 is that somehow Henry Blackburn, the character from Battlefield 3, is also a part of this entire thing, as in the 2020s, he became the owner and CEO of the world's largest group of PMCs. Now, we don't know if that group is also Pax Armada, but I'm willing to bet throughout Battlefield 6, that is where the blanks will be filled in. Now, that kind of fits together most of the present or near future games, but it doesn't quite end there. So Battlefield 2142, taking place a century after this, depicts a story of escalating climate change and a catastrophic ice age which began in the year 2106. The world's population basically has fallen apart at this point, and there's a war going on between the Pan-Asian Coalition and the European Union over the remaining land. Now, it is not clear whether or not this is technically canon, as we've already seen the UK and the European Union fall apart in Battlefield 6 and, of course, Battlefield 2042, so it's hard to say whether it is or not. Speaking of which, while we're here, I should probably say there's 3 games that I have not mentioned, and that is Bad Company 1 and Bad Company 2. There's a lot in those games that actually hints that they take place in another universe. Speaking of which, apparently Battlefield Hardline is as well, as one of the actors who plays President Fernandez in Battlefield 6 is the same voice actor as Dawes. Now, that could potentially still be in the same universe, but there's some other things hinting that that is not the case as well, with some problems with the timeline as a whole. I just wanted to include those just in case you were wondering if they were involved. But at this point, that is the full timeline of Battlefield. If you enjoyed it, it would be greatly appreciated if you could hit that like button, subscribe. If you want to stay up to date on any video game story, this is the place for you. This one took a while, so seriously, if you could hit that like button, it would be very greatly appreciated. And as always, until next time, peace.